You're not going to be able to know the end of this election, in my opinion, for weeks, months, maybe never.
U.S. President Donald Trump casting doubt on the U.S. electoral process, claiming mail-in votes would be fraudulent. Hi, everyone. I'm Sean Callebs, filling in for Anand Naidoo, and this is The Heat. Hi, everyone. With just over 2 months to the U.S. presidential election, there are growing concerns about voter suppression. In recent weeks, U.S. President Donald Trump has floated the idea of postponing the November 3rd election, questioning the efficiency of the Postal Service and casting doubt about the legitimacy of the election. With more than 6 million cases of COVID-19 in the United States and more than 183,000 deaths, voters are weighing the importance of their vote over concerns for their safeties. For more on U.S. voting rights and the 2020 presidential campaign, let's bring in our panel. Joining us from North Carolina, Theodore M. He is a distinguished professor of law and the director of the Center for Civil Rights at the University of North Carolina. Also with us from Illinois is Scot Schraufnagel. He is a professor and chair of the Department of Political Science at Northern Illinois University. Christopher Harris is the executive director of Unhyphenatedamerica.org here in Washington, D.C. And from Indiana, Luis Fraga. He is a professor and director of the Institute for Latino Studies at the University of Notre Dame. Gentlemen, thank you all for joining us today. We're going to have I think, a somewhat enjoyable topic to talk about. Scott, I want to get right to you because U.S. President Donald Trump has been so outspoken about mail-in votes. A couple of things first, but I want you to listen to what he had to say just recently about mail-in votes.
People are going to get ballots that had no intention of voting, that maybe shouldn't be voting, that maybe aren't, and they say the computers will pick it up. The computers are going to pick up nothing. They're going to pick up nothing. You'll have double voting where they send in a ballot and then they'll go and vote. That's going to be a big problem. I say this for the media. This will be the greatest catastrophe, one of the greatest catastrophes in the history of our country. That's how serious it is.
Okay, Scott, a lot to get to, but firstly, why is he saying that? There are a lot of concerns out there that he is literally planting the seeds for challenging this vote once it happens.
Right. The irony here is that there's no research that suggests a particular partisan advantage to voting by mail. You know, when we first started implementing convenience voting procedures like vote by mail, but early voting and so forth, the conventional wisdom that there would be a Republican advantage. So it doesn't appear as that he's motivated by like partisanship, because mail-in voting in all likelihood is going to, I mean, it's a wash, but I mean, it could benefit him, and there's theory that would suggest that it would. So his motivation, I mean, perhaps he doesn't understand that or doesn't know that. I can't speak for him, but maybe then his motivation is just simply about trying to draw, you know, inferences about the election being, you know, illegitimate, so that in case he doesn't like the outcome, he can make that call or make that claim.
Yeah, Scott, but we also want to make the distinction between mail-in ballots and absentee ballots. Do you think he's trying to muddy the water with that?
Well, yeah. So right now, as it stands, there's 5 states that have institutionalized mail-in voting, and and they've done it, Oregon the longest, for 20 years now. With COVID and because of concerns for the spread of the disease and so forth, there's another 4 states and DC who have also adopted true mail-in voting. That is where the ballot will be sent out to registered voters. Other states have relaxed their absentee voting procedures, but that's not the same as mail-in voting, as you've indicated, and the two shouldn't be confused.
Yep. Ted, you almost need a scorecard right now to keep up with what is going on. All the changes, all the litigation that is floating around out there, and certainly is going to happen in the months, days leading up, and certainly thereafter. This presidential election is already on track to be the most litigated ever. More than 100 pandemic-related lawsuits already, but perhaps even more importantly, the dozens of voting rights measures that are out there right now. What does that tell you, Ted?
Well, it tells us is that the President of the United States has put a lot out here that seems to be aimed at undermining faith in the electoral processes and the democratic processes, and is already predicting that the outcome may not be known after the election for quite some time. So it's very disturbing. It's even dangerous rhetorically to undermine voters' faith in the political processes, democratic process. And it tells us that we're in uncharted territories in many ways. Having said that, there are a lot of good people who work on elections and make sure that they are what they are supposed to be. And I have faith that they're going to do the best they can.
Yeah, I think you're right when you talk about those poll workers, but they're getting older, and there's a lot of concerns with coronavirus out there right now, and there's been an effort to try to bring more and more young people into this whole process. Christopher, I want to ask you, because the Republican National Committee has already earmarked some $20 million to take on this litigation, basically saying that they want to just keep fighting the Democrats at every turn. Is this necessary? Where is this taking us? And your thoughts on what our previous two guests had to say so far?
I think the people who are doing the most to undermine the integrity of the vote are those who are basically suggesting that we do anything other than show up and vote in person. We've always had two ways to vote in the United States of America. You could either show up and vote in person, or we've had absentee ballots. And as the other gentleman was saying, that's not the same thing as mail-in ballots. Okay, those are two entirely different things. And people who are going and trying to act like they're not, that they are the same thing, are being disingenuous. And as far as whether the president or the Republican Party stands to benefit the most, I think those who are trying to promote mail-in ballots, which can easily be corrupted. I know President Obama said that the American electoral process could not be corrupted, except it can through mail-in ballots. When you're automatically sending out ballots, listen, how many times have you ever gotten mail that did not belong to you? Did you go out of your way to make sure that mail got to the next person?
Yeah, but Christopher, isn't the argument that the computer is there to sort through all this and deal with these kind of concerns?
And you trust the computers to do all that?
Well, I certainly trust the electoral process.
Let's look at New York. Hold on. Let's look at New York, for example. We know about the 12th Congressional District. They had their vote, what, June 20th or something like that? They allowed the votes to be counted until June 30th. We're 62 days past that primary, a Democratic primary, and we still don't know who won.
Okay, but
so that was 380,000 votes. We're talking about 138 million plus votes are going to be cast, and you really want to trust that system, which hasn't worked on a congressional district level, to work nationwide? Is that what you really want to trust?
Luis, I was in Atlanta right after the election down there, and I think a lot of people say that was just a fiasco the way it unfolded. And if you look at the counties, you look at the precincts where it was really punishing, where people of color vote. Your concerns about moving forward about this, do you think that there are efforts out there trying to suppress the vote of people of color here in the U.S.?
There's no question that there's an active effort to set a tone for the election that not only makes the electoral results suspect, but I think more importantly, tries to discredit the election and in that way discourage voters. So in addition to all of the voter suppression efforts, whether it's voter identification or the purging of voter rolls or not having sufficient machines in minority neighborhoods or other means, there is unquestionably an effort by this administration and the president in particular to simply get people not to think that the election is likely to be valid. I think the goal here is to suppress voter turnout by those who he thinks are more likely to support his opponent.
Well, Scott, I think that a lot of people in the U.S. like to look at this nation as really the shining city on the hill for democracy. But look at what's going on now. 36 states have identification requirements at the polls. Of those, 7 states have strict photo ID laws under which voters must present a government-issued photo ID to vote. What is the intention behind these voter ID laws, and is that going to make it harder or simply make it more fair?
Well, I've got research now that shows that, when you look at Republican Party control of state legislatures, we've created a cost of voting index that takes into account 36 different variables and develops an index for the relative cost of voting in each of the American states. You look at Republican Party control of state legislatures, the ones who are determining these laws, it does not correlate positively with the cost of voting. But when you interact it with 2 different considerations, you interact it with the African American population in the state or the growing Latinx population in the state, and the statistical models pop. And so in states with low Black population, little or no growing Latinx population, Republican Party control, the cost of voting is reasonable. States like North Dakota, South Dakota, Wyoming, Montana. But when you move to states with larger Black populations or growing Latinx populations, now Republican Party control of state legislatures does predict the cost of voting.
Give an example of those states, please. I mean, which states are you talking about, and which areas in those states are you talking about that have that problem?
It's an aggregate analysis. It's a state-by-state analysis. So all of the states with a certain level of African American population growing. So it's mostly in the South. Delaware, though, also shows up. Like the Latinx population by itself does not predict the cost of voting, because you got states like New Mexico, California, relatively large Latinx populations, and the cost of voting is relatively low. The state that came in the 2020 index with the highest cost of voting is Texas.
Yeah, and Christopher, I'd like you to answer this too, because Texas has gone red for such a long period of time, and is apparently going to be much more hard fought this election season. But in essence, to get a mail-in vote, if you're over 65, all you have to do is say, I want one. But if you're under 65, you have to show a reason to get one. And the argument being is a lot of these young voters are going to vote Democratic. How would you respond to that accusation?
Well, first I want to address the fact that I still find it highly insulting to think that Black people are so inept that we can't find a way to get a photo ID to go vote. I mean, people are acting like all of the Black people out there are fresh off the plantation and don't have any sort of government-issued ID, and that don't have a way to get to the polls, and so our votes are being suppressed. That's the most asinine thing, and it's extremely insulting to say that. But everything that you're talking about doesn't make sense. None of it makes sense.
In
Black
what way?
Black people can show up and vote. You look in areas like we'll take Georgia, we'll take Atlanta. You took all these areas. What you'll see is when you have a large Black population, they somehow manage to elect Black people to all levels of government. Right? Atlanta. Look at someone look at Atlanta. Black people are all throughout the government and all the elected officials. Yes, the state overall might be red, but Atlanta's Black. So you're telling me that Black folks in Atlanta, one of the deepest Black states, in the South, one of the deepest southern states, Black folks can't find out a way to vote? Is that what you're saying?
No, I'm just going back and looking at what happened in June 7th when people went out to vote. In the precincts that were Black, they had tremendously long lines. Some people waited 5 hours. I talked with these people. I was with these folks. And if you go to predominantly white suburbs, it took 10, 15 minutes. Can you explain that?
So why are there not more polling places? Who is stopping that from happening? I mean, this is what's crazy is people are acting like this happens every year and that somehow government can't seem to figure out a way to open up a handful more of polling stations. Is that what we're saying? Is that government can't figure it out?
You mentioned Georgia. Georgia, Arizona, and Texas have both gone to great lengths to remove voting stations here in just recent times.
And only public pressure has got them to add more and more. But Theodore, I want to talk about what happened here this past Friday, the 57th anniversary of Dr. King's historic March on Washington, and tens of thousands of people showing back up at the Lincoln Memorial on that day. And listen to what the late Reverend King's oldest son, Martin Luther King III, had to say.
And now we must march to the ballot box and the mailboxes to defend the freedoms that earlier generations worked so hard to win. Our voting rights are under attack. We must vigorously defend our right to vote, because those rights were paid for with the blood of those lynched for seeking to exercise their constitutional rights. They were paid for with the blood of civil rights workers.
Theodore, is this inflammatory or fair?
Well, there's nothing inflammatory about saying that the ballot for African Americans was bought and paid for in blood. There's no question about that. You know, it's clear that there are still efforts to suppress black voting. With all due respect to my fellow panelists, you know, things like voter ID, that's a much more nuanced conversation. Voter ID is supposed to cure voter fraud. Voter fraud is almost completely non-existent.
Oh, no, that's not. There are so
hang on,
many
please.
examples.
Well, wait a
I'll get
minute.
you just a second,
I
please.
stayed out for a while, and you know, this is my turn, please. The evidence of voter fraud is that it is extremely low, almost non-existent. I want us to think about what happened in Katrina a few years back. Everybody thought that everybody was getting out, and it's because everybody had cars or transportation, and then we found out they didn't. There are millions of people in this country, poor people, senior citizens, who don't have government ID. And to elevate having government ID to the point where it transcends whether somebody can cast a ballot really is undemocratic in many ways. So, again, the right to vote, bought and paid for in blood. The Edmund Pettus Bridge, Viola Liuzzo, you know, many other Americans, black and white, died for the right to vote. And it's not rhetoric or excessive rhetoric when Martin Luther King III says that that was bought at that price.
Christopher?
What I think is that all these individuals talking about that.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
I'm sorry, all these individuals talking are being disingenuous because they're not telling the whole story. They're telling a story, but they're not telling the story. Let's talk about the history. Let's talk about the 1957 Civil Rights Act. Let's talk about the 1960 Civil Rights Act. Guess who was pushing for those voting rights acts? It was Republicans. President Dwight D. Eisenhower, who had a big old R after his name, was the first one in 75 years. And by the way, that previous 75 years, who was pushing for it? No one with a D was pushing for Voting Rights Act. All that was done by Republicans. And guess who it was who helped to defang the 57 and 1960 Civil Rights Act? I think it was a Democrat. I think it was Lyndon Baines Johnson, the master of the Senate. Everybody acts like Lyndon Johnson all of a sudden. They act like he was this great savior for black folks. But yeah, the reason why he took advantage and voted in the 1965 Voting Rights Act because it was politically expedient for him. He was never in favor of that, especially as long as it didn't benefit him. He defanged those two important pieces of legislation. Anyone can go and look it up, the 1957, the 1960 Voting Rights Act. Dwight D. Eisenhower demanded in his 1959 address to Congress that we need to make sure that all rights are protected for all Americans.
Louis, I think you...
Democrat.
Louis, I think you...
Today's
I was just going to...
Louis, go ahead, please.
I was just going to add that if you go back and look at that legislation, it was extremely weak and was not anywhere near
was it
what
weak
happened
after it was signed, or was it weak when it was presented?
It was extremely weak. And if you go back to Lyndon Johnson, he said that in supporting, promoting, using all of his legislative capacity to get the 1965 Voting Rights Act passed, he was writing off the white South for the Democratic Party forever. He was
Except
writing
that's
it
not
off. The
true,
White
because
South was
Carter
going to
won in
move to another
1972.
party. So he
76,
understood the politics extremely well. He understood what he was doing, but he felt, I think, a moral compulsion to in fact respond in a way supportive of all of the protest activity that occurred, and especially the outrage of the way in which African Americans were treated by local law enforcement. Interestingly enough, to parallels today, many local law enforcement officials in southern communities.
Yeah, and I want to move forward. Ted, let's talk about the fact that so-called observers are apparently going to be out at a number of polling precincts this year, as many as 50,000, a lot of them law enforcement officers. President Donald Trump has made it clear he would like these observers to be out there, and there are concerns that this could intimidate voters. Do you think that that is a fair argument?
It's a danger.
It is absolutely designed to intimidate voters.
Okay, let's let.
It is designed, and it's got a long history and tradition in the United States.
Luis, hang on just one second,
to inhibit
please.
people from voting who may have parking tickets, who may have some other reason for thinking that they're going to get picked up by local law enforcement. There's no question what the purpose is of putting local law enforcement there, and it's a Southern tradition and one that's been used in other jurisdictions, and it's very unfortunate that he's promoting it now.
Okay. Ted, do you have anything you'd like to add to that? And then I'd like to get Christopher's take on this. Oh, I'm sorry. We apparently have lost Ted. I'm here to confirm what we suspect, having a little technical difficulties. But Christopher, let's talk about that. Is that a real concern? Because if there are people out there, some 23 million immigrants are eligible to vote in this year, making up about 10% of the nation's overall electorate. If these observers are out there at the polls, are you concerned that this could have any kind of heavy-handed, not necessarily action, but just by the fact that they're there, intimidation?
Every 4 years, they pull this same junk. Every 4 years, they pull this same junk, and they tell blacks and other minorities that you're supposed to be afraid of the cops, and they want to make it seem like every black person, every time they see a police officer, that they're living in fear because they're listening to people like LeBron James, when the reality is most of us don't live in fear. You can go up to Baltimore like Kimberly Klacik, who's running for office up there. She went and asked people in her neighborhood, hey, do you want to defund the police? You can ask people in Harlem, do you want to defund the police? They're like, no, we need the police. So you're telling me, when the reality is those people who live in those areas are saying, no, we need the police, but you're going to sit there and tell me is that people are afraid to show up and vote because of the police? So they go about their day-to-day lives with a heavy police presence, but now all of a sudden, when it comes time to go and vote, they're afraid of the police. Look, first of all, the police are not going around checking people's IDs. They're not running a scan and saying, hey, let me see, do you have parking tickets? They're not there for that. They're there to preserve the peace. There's only one group of people who want to defund the police, and that's the left. That's Democrats. They're the ones who want to do that. But everyone else who are law-abiding citizens, all the immigrants who went through the onerous process to become citizens of the United States, they should be more than happy to show up, because if they're not doing anything illegal, which, by the way, most of the people who went to the naturalization process, they know the laws better than most of the citizens who were born and raised here. So they know if I go up to I show up with my ID, which, by the way, they all have an ID. You could not have become a naturalized citizen without having some form of government-issued ID. So why in the world would they be intimidated, like somebody's going to keep them from voting? Yeah. I mean, it's ridiculous. It's fear-mongering, and you should be ashamed of yourself for continually promoting that, because it's just not accurate.
Well, let's, Scott, let's talk about what President Trump has said, in the sense that if he loses, the only way he can lose is if this is rigged. What does that kind of message send to the folks out there?
Well, that's a dangerous message. The election won't be rigged. The beautiful thing about the American electoral system is very decentralized, and for someone to rig the election, I mean, the only way it gets rigged is like a mass misinformation campaign by Russians or some foreign, that's the type of fraud that you have to worry about. But actual fraud, like people impersonating somebody that is so minuscule and so seldom. The Heritage Foundation, a think tank in D.C., they have, and the White House links to their website, they have a list. If you go to their instances of voter fraud and you start scrolling, And you can scroll and scroll and scroll, and it creates this impression of massive voter fraud. Well, if you get to the bottom of the list, it's 1,200 cases, and that's over 50 states, and some of their cases go back to 1998. So that's 50 states over 20 years. Do the math, 1,200 cases. That's about how much voter fraud we have.
Ted,
But when you say that he's acting like this one person only stole one person's identity, no, these are vote harvesters. They're oftentimes stealing dozens, hundreds, or thousands of votes. So when you say 1,200 cases, that's 1,200 usually times at least 100 times 1,000. See, so when you're being honest about it, you realize that
Christopher, I got to cut you off there.
The vast majority of the cases of voter fraud are people with felony convictions who vote mistakenly because they think they can. There's undocumented people that have voted.
Okay,
those are in that list. And the reason they voted, though, is because they didn't know better. They thought they were eligible to vote.
Ted, I want to
go to court. They get thrown out because fraud requires sort of devious intent, and there's nothing there.
So you're denying the existence of vote harvesting.
Hang on just a minute, gentlemen. Ted,
you're denying the existence of vote harvesting.
Gentlemen, we're running out of time. Ted, I want to kind of move on. We haven't talked about the other candidate in this election. George Packer, a staff writer for The Atlantic, predicts if Trump wins, what's happening in Kenosha could be part of the reason. His contention is Biden simply is not doing enough. Listen to what Biden had to say.
I want to make it absolutely clear, something very clear about all of this. Rioting is not protesting. Looting is not protesting. Setting fires is not protesting. None of this is protesting. It's lawlessness, plain and simple. And those who do it should be prosecuted. Violence will not bring change. It'll only bring destruction.
Now, Ted, despite what Christopher may have said, do you think that there are people out there who legitimately are frustrated and who are concerned about police, who do believe they are targets? And how do you take Biden's message?
Well, I think that Joe Biden is saying what is obvious, which is that violence is not helpful. I think he's compelled to be very explicit about that. There are people who may be trying to undermine the protests, but there are a lot of people who are protesting in the tradition of what the First Amendment allows. And so there are people who may be trying to undermine and pollute those protests. But
what do you mean by undermine and pollute those protests? Please explain what you mean.
Gentlemen, I'd love to get to this, but we are actually out of time today. Christopher, I really appreciate your insight into all this. It's been a great guest. Ted as well, Scott, and Luis, I want to thank you all. And that does it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Sean Callebs here in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching. Please stay tuned to CGTN America.